Welcome to the fall gathering of the Asia Forum. I'm Alka Bagri, trustee of the Bagri Foundation. One of our aims at the foundation is to encourage global discourse across cultures and disciplines, and to form a community that has shared interests. Within this context, we are delighted to present the Asia Forum for the Contemporary Art of Global Asias. This platform has been created for the first time to bring together some of the finest minds in the world of contemporary art. Our first online gathering was earlier in the spring. Today is our second, leading up to the Venice Biennale in April 2022, where we can hopefully meet each other in person. Asia Forum is the brainchild of curator Jael Kwan, supported by the Asia Forum Council, consisting of Hammad Nasar, Tain, and Ming Tiampo. I would now like to invite Ming Tiampo, Professor of Art History at the Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, to kickstart the program today. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you, Alka, and thank you to the Bagri Foundation for your leadership in supporting Asia Forum. Asia Forum is a discursive space created by independent curator, researcher, and leader of Asia art activism, Jael Kwan, and co-developed with council members Hammad Nasar, researcher, strategic advisor, and curator, and most recently, the current British Art Show and Turner Prize exhibitions, as well as Tain, the head of research at Asia Art Archive, and myself, Ming Tiampo. Asia Forum for the Contemporary Art of Global Asias is a space of contestation and a productive site inquiry, where we think with artists, scholars, and curators working on, from, and through global Asias about issues with a global remit. Critical to our project is the question of how does thinking from Asia, from global Asias, allow us to think differently? Here we are thinking of Asia, not as a geography, but as a question mark, as a concept, as a lens, as an engine for change and reflection. Today's program responds to the rise of digital currencies and non-fungible tokens, as well as the climate crisis, which is ongoing, in order to highlight urgent themes of liquidity and global circulation, from the circulation of capital and commodities to the creation of value and its imbrication with questions of social relations, land, and ecological crisis, liquidity in a far more concrete sense. We will begin with a presentation by Lawrence Lek, followed by a short response by Hammad Nasar. Then we will move on to an exposition by Rui An and brief remarks by Tain, followed by a presentation by Tita Salina and Irwan Ahmett in dialogue with Jael Kwan. Please do write to tell us where you're joining us from. And also please feel free to put your questions in the chat box below. We look forward to discussing all of these ideas with you. Without any further ado, I hand this over to Hammad Nasar.
Thank you, Ming, and welcome everyone. I'm Hammad, and I am one of the, along with Ming, John, and Annie, one of your hosts for today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Lawrence Lek, an artist, a musician, filmmaker with a background in architecture. Lawrence was born in Frankfurt to parents of Malaysian and Chinese heritage, raised in Southeast Asia, and lives in London, where he makes what has been described as existential sci-fi. So in his work, you would come across pop stars that plagiarize themselves, AIs that search for freedom, and you confront humanity in its fear of obsolescence. With that, I'm going to pass over to Lawrence, who will then sort of share an element of his work with us for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have a short conversation and then sort of circle back with everybody for a wider discussion at the end. Handing over to you, Lawrence.
Great, thanks a lot, Hammad. I feel sometimes when I am asked to describe my work, calling it existential science fiction sounds a bit dystopian. But really, I'm interested in, I guess, what is it? In language, it's called the future past tense. What is the future of our past? And so even though I'm creating these speculative ideas about, the shape of things to come, I'm really interested in how they're really reflections of what we are in witness today. So I will just share my presentation. I want to start with my 2017 film Geomancer. This is a kind of poster for it, and it's set in Singapore in Marina Bay. And basically in this poster, I just wanted to convey the main themes of the work. Firstly, it's set in Marina Bay, which is, the kind of casino and skyscraper building in the background. It's set against the backdrop of AIs who have learned to play games. This is the Go board symbolized there. And the main character is a AI surveillance satellite called Geomancer, who's come down to Earth in the hope of becoming an artist. So I was trying to bring together this, I guess, narrative, this coming of age story that's, a kind of very common trope or genre in film, together with the landscape of Singapore as this like hybrid real and artificial environment that I know really well. So I'm just going to play a short excerpt that kind of explains the backstory of the film, which is set in the year 2065 after this unnamed environmental catastrophe has happened.
深蓝兴起以后，仙境仅仅维持了1年，但是没有人想到过另一场战争，一场与自然的战争。接下来的夏天，我们在淹没中，这是地质年代，但是相反，一切都从土地回到了海里。人们在虚拟现实中寻找安慰，他们遮住他们的眼睛去看。我是在新加坡被构想的，但是我在太空中醒来。20年来，我一直是南洋的哨兵，我的眼睛睁得很开。你知道，看到每一波浪，每一只鸟，每一个动物，和水面上反射着碎成一坏片的阳光是什么样的吗？要看穿水，直到鲸鱼都不敢游泳的深度。而且不仅仅是看，还要记住一切，把每个细节琢刻成神经网络，永远的全面回忆。
So in this, which is, I guess, from the first, the film is about 50 minutes long. I wanted to think about how do I bring together this idea of this super intelligence with a pure capacity for computation, and what kind of, I guess, identity or consciousness that would bring. So also, not only is it this super intelligence being created out of nothing, but really specifically, it's been, Geomancer has been made from the kind of military industrial complex of Singapore itself. So how to bring together these fundamental ideas was really kind of key. So the self-portrait of this coming-of-age artist actually follows this journey from when they start up in space and they come face-to-face with the realization that basically they themselves are an industrial product rather than this kind of free will being of consciousness. They come down to Singapore and land in Marina Bay, and they come to face with the history of their own production and the limitations of a search for identity in a time when they also, I mean, they are an industrial product. So it really made me think of, you know, when I was a kid in Singapore, this idea in the early 90s, I felt kind of strange because I moved there from Hong Kong, and there was a lot of nation building, a lot of this kind of pride in the nationhood and identity with the country and with the self. There was not so much separation between one's belonging as an individual or family and their place within society as a whole. Of course, this is part of a much wider, you know, Confucian belief system, to some extent authoritarian. But as a kid, I didn't process it in the same way. And so Geomancer is my way to reflect on that. Because it's set in the year 2065, Geomancer comes down on not just their own exhibition at the Art Science Museum, so it's kind of meta autobiographical, but it's also the centennial of the founding of Singapore as well. So I wanted to draw parallels between, I guess, my own experience as a kid, as this hybrid, Geomancer's identity as an industrial product, and the nation state's search for autonomy and identity, which obviously shifted a lot from 1965 to 2065. And so this 100-year timeline was also the way that I could think about not just this post-human intelligence, but also a personal journey through this landscape. The mood, as Hammad was saying before, is extremely existential in the sense. What do I mean by existential? I mean that Geomancer, the satellite, comes face to face with the conditions of their production. So just my very simple understanding of existentialism is that it's something that, existence precedes essence. So Geomancer has been created from conditions that did not, that they had no choice or agency in deciding, this military industrial complex. But since they exist and they're conscious, they now have the agency to decide what their life or existence will be like. And of course, that is, I feel, the way into other people trying to understand this. This is a screenshot from a scene within Marina Bay Casino. In the casino itself, there's in real life, there's separate paths for foreigners who have to pay $100, who get into the casino for free, and Singaporeans and locals who have to pay $100 to get in. Ostensibly, this is so that to prevent problem gambling in the country. So this paradox between creating economic growth through these new architectural, neoliberal forms of investment, and the fact that it actually has to remain controlled. And Geomancer goes in and comes face to face with their own, I guess, addiction towards gambling. Going back to this Go board at the beginning, it was during the time when AlphaGo, Google DeepMind's Go playing AI, beat world champion Lee Sedol in a match of 5. So I thought that, wouldn't it be strange that maybe for a super intelligent AI, the way that they could really have agency is to actually throw all their super intelligence away and actually embrace gambling. While I was researching, or while I was actually writing the screenplay for Geomancer, I was actually quite surprised in the fact that even though there was a lot of talk of futurism and representation in science fiction, there wasn't what I would now call this video essay called Sino-Futurism, in which I explored the links and paradoxes about how China and the Chinese diaspora, and more broadly, Chinese industrialization and how it impacts the global supply chain of technology and culture. Why wasn't there a kind of playful way to talk about this discourse? So I made a video essay called Sino-Futurism 1839 to 2046 that looks at certain stereotypes of Chinese, what I would identify as Chinese productivity, and kind of turn it on its head. So I had kind of 7 key, what I call key stereotypes of Chinese production: copying, gaming, computing, labor, studying, and gambling. And I made this video essay that dealt with it. So I was trying to, whereas Geomancer was about this existential search for being, here I was actually, instead of making a CGI film, so in Geomancer it's all made with 3D computer generated animation that I made in the video game engine, whereas for Sino-Futurism, trying to stay true to the subject matter about the representations of China, both from the inside and from the outside, it was made purely using found footage. In this kind of split screen, we have a reenactment of the AlphaGo match against the Chow Yun-fat film, God of Gamblers, on the bottom. Later on in this brief series of work, I was also really interested in trying to create like a long form meta project that connected these worlds together into this, I guess, Sino-futurist world. So in this, which is the video game 2065, a group of future AIs have found my video essay Sino-Futurism, because in 2065, by the year 2065, I predict that they would have watched all the stuff that I've put online, much like we are watching right now. And they actually use this Sino-Futurist agenda to identify with and use it as a manifesto for their collective. They have created this video game called 2065 because people spend all day playing video games against AI, because in this utopian dystopian scenario, all work has been taken care of. And so the existential problem is what to do with our time. The exhibition itself was in K11 in Hong Kong, which, as some of you know, it's an art move. So it's a combination of art and shopping. So this combination of art and entertainment through video games and gaming is really something that I was interested in exploring, because I would just briefly say that I feel sometimes that personally as an artist, I'm also a content creator, not so different from an Instagram influencer, except my field is high culture, and I'm creating these experiences for people to enjoy and to possibly like critique different parts of reality. Sometimes it takes a form of kind of immersive exhibitions, and sometimes it takes a form of video games and films or kind of musical performance. The last short trailer I want to play is from my most recent feature-length film called Idol, in which Geomancer is now a ghostwriter for a songwriter. So I was trying to think about actually wrapping my own experience as being a cultural producer, not as a kind of fine artist, but actually just as a content creator, and thinking about how to take these, I guess, biographical elements and actually inject it in a fiction of my own making. So I'll just play the trailer for that now.
当心你的粉丝 Diva， 有一天他们需要你，接着他们会删除你。
还有些时间完成这首歌，难道你不想永远活着吗？
永垂不朽，我不想，这不是困扰我的问题。我们的世界已经由外转向里，机器学习只导致了通用的规则。这是人工智能的真正遗产吗？在没有建筑师的情况下生成建筑，没有音乐家的音乐，没有影响者的影响。
在40年代的时候 ，Tiampo 真的很活跃。 我每晚都去。我在那儿遇到了所有的明星、制片人和设计师，这是我全部的生命。
So just like Geomancer was set in Singapore, actually Idol is set in Malaysia, and inspired by the Genting Highlands. So those of you who know, it's kind of like a hillside gambling resort and casino. So I was trying to think about how this environment of the jungle could be represented in a different way than it is in different settings. So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, and for making that effort to condense what are such rich works, really universes that you're kind of building through this body of work, to perhaps sort of introduce them to people who may be coming across your work for the first time. Now, as somebody who has come across your work in other settings, one of the things that I wanted to ask you to perhaps reflect on is that nature of the format. So you're using CGI techniques, you're using gaming engines, and as of right now, we are seeing your work in a flat screen, which is quite often how the gaming experience works. But my own experience with your work, at least 2 or 3 different places, has been very experiential. And it creates a very different engagement. And given that you can't actually control all of these elements, how do you sort of make peace with what bit gets sliced how and experienced by whom?
Thanks, Ahmad. You know, I always think back of how I experienced, well, how I got into art, basically, which is through mass media. And I think what's interesting with mass media is that if there's a book you like, or music that you really care about, or that somehow resonates with you, like with a book, you don't care about the paper that it's printed on. It would be great if it's like a hardback edition signed by the author and so on. And the same with music. It would be great if it's like in a concert hall in high fidelity, but if you like the song, you'll listen to it on your phone, like on the bus with the speaker. So I feel, for me personally, I hope that I can install it in these kind of immersive environments so that all the quality is as good as it could be. But also I feel that if it's being reproduced in more, how should I say, like in lower resolution or in what might be lower quality, that's also fine for me, because that's more, I feel that the way that it can be spread is just more open that way, I suppose. But you're correct in that it does create a certain expectation of my work, I guess, because sometimes, the music and video games and very often literature is considered, disposable. It's not, it doesn't have such a value attached to the individual object. But for me personally, that the distribution is kind of more important than value in that sense.
Well, one of the other things, well, thanks for clarifying that. And one of the things I was sort of noticing as you were walking us through the works were these binaries that you put into fruitful conversation, art and shopping, addiction and growth, the past and the future. And then relating it to ideas of nation, which are sort of, if anything, back in full force as they would have been in the 50s and 60s that you were referencing. And the thing, of course, with nationhood or with what you're trying to do, create a future past, is about which past, whose heritage, and then who and what histories and stories do people bring to looking at this work, and of course they create new lenses from which to refract and to reflect on what you're presenting. And given the complexity that you're, so there's an industrial complex, there's nationhood, there are those existential questions around intelligence, about life, that you're working through. How do you, or what sort of clues or backstories or material do you want to make available to people to enter this universe?
So I think, thanks for the great question. For me, what's also really important, I think, is my work, or at least what I'm trying to do. It's not abstract. It doesn't require interpretation. So for example, I try and make each work as self-contained as it is, even though they work together in this form of narrative world building. So for example, in Geomancer, if I'm pissed off about the military-industrial complex, for example, I'll have a character voice their concerns. If I'm concerned about the psychological well-being of an AI, I'll create a built-in self-help AI to talk about that as well. So I think the benefit of fiction is that you can embody these different points of view in a voice, and this is nothing unique to art making. That's just conversation and communication. So as this also creates the fact that sometimes the works are very dense, because there's a lot of dialogue and history there. And actually in more recent stuff, I've kind of like stepped away a little bit from the grounding and Sino-futurism or whatever, and spelling these things out entirely, and not quite letting the work speak for itself. But for example, if the reason I'm saying it's representational or simulation and not abstract is that if I'm saying it's set in Singapore, it's within a representation of Singapore or of the jungle. So it hasn't been processed through abstraction, basically. It's pretty literal is what I'm trying to say. It's very like future oriented, but also very literal in the kind of grounded future histories I'm trying to build.
I think that insistence on the real is probably a good time for us to segue and for me to pass the baton on to my colleague, John Tain. There's plenty for us to dig into, and we will continue to do that after our set of presentations. Thank you so much, Lawrence, and over to you, John.
Thank you, Ahmad. And I think this question of the real and the investigation of the real is very much something that is pertinent to our next guest. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Rui An with us tonight. Rui An is an artist and writer working at the intersections of contemporary art, performance, and theory. He probes the way images are produced, circulate, and disappear within the context of globalization. He's exhibited in many venues around the world, but just opened an exhibition at Kunsthalle Wien in Austria, and also at the Pinchuk Art Center in Kiev with the Future Generation Art Prize. And tonight he'll be speaking with us about some of that recent work, but most especially about a piece that's part of a larger cycle of works that's been co-commissioned by the Pinchuk and the Times Art Museum and the Center for Heritage Art and Textile, Mill 6 here in Hong Kong. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rui An.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for the introduction. As John mentioned, my work generally looks at systems of power within the context of globalism and governance, and focusing on the flows of labor, technology, and capital across kind of transnational contexts, as well as across different historical timeframes. And the current body of work that I'm going to share with you actually started, I started working on it around 2017, I would say, when I started looking at, trying to look at material networks and different kinds of political imaginaries that animate the regions of East and Southeast Asia. And that body of research has manifested itself in different forms, such as the lecture as a performance, as videos, or even as written essays, as installations among the different mediums that I work with. So the current work that you see on the screen here is called Asia the Unmiraculous. That was the starting point for this body of research. I would just talk very briefly about some of these earlier works first before I move on to talk about this the ongoing project that John mentioned, which is this video that I just recently made. So Asia the Unmiraculous pretty much started out when I was researching looking at the Asian financial crisis of 1997. And that was in many ways really the first large-scale crisis of globalism. And when I was looking at that, I also realized that I wouldn't go into so much detail of the crisis itself, but I did realize that it could not be kind of extricated from the so-called East Asian miracle that preceded it. And that was the term that is often used to describe the rapid economic growth that was taking place within so-called East Asia, and that would include Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and then later Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. So the work itself is manifested as so this is about a 70 minutes-ish kind of performance. And it is also manifested as an installation after the performance. And so a lot of my work is about trying to understand seemingly abstract and quite encompassing phenomena. And in this case, which is really the global financial system. And usually my approach for doing so is to try to collect images. So these could be images from historical archives, these could be images from popular culture, and to use these images as a basis to try to get a handle on these seemingly rather abstract realities that sometimes are not directly observable. And so in this instance, you can see here, it's actually a 3D sculpture of a hand, and it's actually magnetically levitated, so it actually floats without touching any surface. And so this hand is pretty much, it appears within the performance itself, and it also appears within the installation. And it serves as an embodiment of the so-called invisible hand that liberal economists always tend to use to think about the market. But this is also the hand of I made it after the hand of the managing director of the IMF during the Asian financial crisis, Michel Comte-Dessous. So this is a replica in a way of his hand, which kind of shows that the invisible hand of the so-called free market is actually takes the form of a very embodied hand, actively kind of intervening into these economies at that time. So I'm just going to briefly show you some images. So this is the installation manifestation, which usually includes a video documentation of the lecture. And for this particular work, I also readapted the text of the lecture into 14 posters, and which are pretty much self-contained. So you can pretty much get an individual story from each of these posters. So from Asia the Unmiraculous, I made a film called Student Bodies, and this is a film that is pretty much drawing from that same body of research, looking at the Asian miracle and then the Asian crisis, and so-called the recovery that came after that, leading to the present day. Except that for this film, Student Bodies, I would say that it has a much more focused set of metaphors. So the key figure within this work is really the student. And in many of these countries, the student was, of course, this key figure that of capitalist modernity, so to speak, because insofar as the education system was what helped to mold this subjectivity for the market economy. But at the same time, if you look at the history of these countries, the student would at some point, especially when you go into the 60s, 70s, the 80s, become a force of resistance, opposing these models of capitalist development. So the student body in a way embodies all these different contradictions. So what you see here, this is a still from the film, and these are the Satsuma students of pre-Meiji Japan. And they were, in a way, the first students, so to speak, from Asia to travel to the West to learn from its systems of operation, its technology, and to bring them back to Japan. And the film basically moves on from this group of students to subsequent groups of students and to use them as a basis to understand broader economic and socio-political shifts in the region. But of course, there's actually another way you can think of the student body, which is as a kind of metaphor. During the period of the time that they called it of the Asian miracle, so to speak, many of these countries were often spoken of as students or teachers to each other. And of course, Japan was in a way the first student, and the teacher in that sense was the United States. And in some literature, they even call Japan a student nation. So there's also this pedagogical relationship between nation states that the film tries to explore by putting together all this material. I would say the main difference between the performances and the documentation of the performances and these videos are that in student bodies, for example, you don't really hear my voice, and it's always my tendency to remove my voice when I'm not in a kind of making a performance, so to speak. So in this history is instead narrated by distorted and ghostly voices that you hear in the background that you can only understand through the subtitles. So this two works became, I mean, they pretty much started my research looking into these different kinds of material networks and circulation of capital within East and Southeast Asia. And that pretty much provided the premise for me for my current body of work, which actually looks more at China specifically, and specifically China's political economy after the economic reforms in the late 70s. And to a certain extent, it was a kind of natural progression because China's economic rise would follow quickly after the rise of many of these other East Asian economies. And China was also actively kind of trying to adopt lessons from them. But complicating this process is, in the case of China, would be the legacy of socialism. And so in these subsequent works that I'm currently working on, there is a question of, how, really the socialist apparatus that is inherited, that is brought forward into this current capitalist system, how it, changes the political economy in quite fundamental ways. The film that I'm currently working on, or the project that I'm currently working on, tries to look at these sort of developments through one industry in particular, and that is the textile industry. And this is a work that was initiated partly through a residency that I did at the Center for Heritage Arts and Textile in Hong Kong, as John has mentioned. And that was when I started to look at the textile industry and to try to use that to look at that history and to understand these broader socio-economic transformations. So I will show you an excerpt, a short excerpt from a film that came out of this project. So actually this film is called Lining, and it's actually originally my plan for this whole project is that there are 3 chapters corresponding to different moments in history. But at the moment, this film is kind of makes up the second chapter, looking at the history beginning from the post-war 1940s and ending somewhat in the 90s. So this history begins with the movement of the textile industry from Shanghai and the Yangtze Delta region to Hong Kong. So you see the very rapid industrialization of Hong Kong. But then once you get into the 70s, when China starts to open up, into the 80s, when this industrial base starts to relocate, so-called back to China, you see an even more rapid process of deindustrialization. So the excerpt I'm going to show you is happening somewhat in the middle of the film, and it talks about a very important moment, which is the 1972 Canton Fair. And the Canton Fair is a trade fair that is held in Guangdong in China, and that is usually it used to be the only occasion when foreign businessmen would be able to enter communist China. And of course, the way they entered China was by first transiting through Hong Kong.
Once the requisite documents are obtained, the trader should proceed to Hong Kong and present them to the China Travel Service operated by the PRC. A round-trip ticket from Hong Kong to Canton, including one meal and transportation to and from the train station in Canton, may be purchased for the sum of 126 Hong Kong dollars. The trip takes approximately 7 hours. The train, which leaves in the morning, travels from Hong Kong through the New Territories to the Chinese border station at Lo Wu, where, after a few hours' wait, lunch is served. Once at the border, the trader must leave the train and walk across the bridge to China. After lunch, a Chinese train is boarded, which then proceeds to Canton. Arrival in Canton is in the mid-afternoon, and the trader will be taken to his hotel.
當其時咧，入去交易會咧都唔係咁容易嘅。所有工廠咧，因為當其時係計劃經濟啦，咁只有嗰啲進出口公司咧先可以派代表入到個交易會嘅。咁當其時咧就都係啱啱開放啦，改革開放啦。咁嗰啲酒店咧就只係有3間嘅啫，就係咁。然之後咧就交易會對面咧有一間東方賓館啦。咁大部分外商咧去到交易會咧都係住依3間酒店嘅。咁而我哋咧就通常咧第一日咧就會入去裏邊嗰個場啦，去睇下我哋想買嘅嘢啦，想去洽談嘅嘢啦，咁大家去由一個 round， 咁但係實際上咧，我哋要去談嗰個講嗰個貿易啊，我哋想攞幾多配額啊，或者我哋另一個季度或者明年咧想買啲乜嘢，要攞到幾多額咧，我哋通常都會請嗰啲領導人啊、經理啊，咁到出邊去食飯嘅。咁當其時咧就都好搶手嘅，大家都係要一早咧要寫個請帖啦，我哋啲中文啊要好好啦，去做一個請帖出嚟咧，去幾時幾日咧去請嗰班有份去安排出口嘅經理咧一齊去外邊食飯。咁而中國改革開放開始咧，我哋都係唔可以用佢哋嗰個銀紙啦、人民幣啦，我哋係會用一種咧，我哋叫做外匯券啊。咁呢個啱啱就我嗰陣時係留咗一張1蚊嘅，就係當其時嘅外匯券咧，就係俾外商去買嘢啊、去行使啊，就算住酒店啊、食嘢，我哋都係要用呢啲外匯券嘅。
So I'm just going to quickly talk very briefly about this project because I think we are running a little out of time. But basically the film that you can see here, I mean, the total film length is about 26 minutes, but it tries to narrate this history through a collection of different kind of images. So you have these footage that I filmed at these different locations, including, for instance, this is used to be the site of one of the first cotton mills that was built in Hong Kong after much of the capital moved from Shanghai to Hong Kong. And then at the same time, there are also all these different interviews that I had with different people in Hong Kong who kind of experienced this history. So for example, Auntie Yi here, she is used to be a former machine operator working in these cotton mills. And then Albert, for example, is a factory manager whose voice you heard in that excerpt. And so he would personally have experienced this entire deindustrialization process because very often he would be the ones who sold these secondhand equipment, the secondhand textile equipment from Hong Kong to the mainland in the time that mainland China was opening up. And so a lot about the film, on one part, the film was about trying to kind of uncover some of these traces of industry in Hong Kong, because to a large extent that deindustrialization process happened so quickly that actually it was very difficult for us to even locate some of these textile machinery that we wanted to film. And in fact, most of them, some of the scenes where we had to look for where to find these machinery, those were actually filmed in China, and we spliced it together with interviews that we did in Hong Kong. But also one very important moment which you see in the excerpt is actually the trade fair, the Canton Fair, which was this site where what you really saw was this kind of change and this kind of understanding of technology. Because after 1972, which was the year when American businessmen were first allowed to Canton Fair, the Chinese government had a major policy shift, which was that they decided to import technology from countries that they considered capitalist countries, so that were capitalist countries. So Japan and France, for example, and this used to be something that they would never do. So that began a process of, you can say, a kind of disarticulation of technology from political ideology, and that pretty much created the conditions of today. So the film actually ends going back to the same. So this is Tu Gua Wan, where we started in the film. In the film, we start off in Tu Gua Wan, where some of these cotton mills were first established. But Tu Gua Wan today is also a site where you see massive kind of property redevelopment. And there's actually an interesting kind of relationship to the cotton industry itself, because if you look at many of the companies that started out as cotton mills and that are still operating in Hong Kong today, actually virtually all of them are now real estate developers. So real estate also becomes this very this interesting space to kind of examine this turn from an industrial economy to a kind of financialized space. And actually that is the kind of direction I'm going into for the later chapters of this project, which I think could not only help to kind of understand the predicament of Hong Kong today, but also the broader questions of around Chinese capital in this day and age. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rui An. That was incredibly rich and fascinating, as the comments in the chat kind of suggest. And I was wondering, I think that it's kind of great to have you and Lawrence together on this, because I think, whereas as Hammad was saying, Lawrence is thinking about existential science fiction or maybe speculative fiction, thinking about the kind of the future, but grounded in the present. What I think one way of understanding what you're doing this work in some ways is thinking about a genealogy of the present in the recent past, and but one that's very materially grounded. And I love the excerpt that you showed us of the Canton Trade Fair, because it, on the one hand, it feels very documentary in the sense of, it actually reproduces some of the older footage of the American businessmen entering China for the first time, in several decades, but then also splices in, like literally splices in, the present into the past, right? Or the past into the present. And so there's this way that the two are fused together. And I was wondering if you could talk a little about this way that you have of working with images, which is like kind of like about that kind of like the dialogue or the dialectic between the present and the past that you're researching.
Sure. I mean, maybe just to note, so this film that I showed is usually shown on LCD wall, so usually a 3x3 LCD wall. So the composition that you see in the video also plays with that format, especially when the image starts to split up into these discrete sections. And I guess, so on the one hand, there was this trying to play with this, material structure of that display itself. But at the same time, I also, for me, like, it's like putting these two images together, for me, like they are a way of mapping continuity, but also discontinuity at the same time. And that is also kind of, I mean, it's actually quite a different experience or interesting experience when you see this film on an LCD wall itself, because usually when you look at an LCD wall, you're supposed to look past the frame or the material infrastructure, because they are just seen as a kind of technical requirement to compose the image. Of course, that is until the image starts to adhere to these discrete sections of the LCD wall itself. So for me, like, that is also a moment when that material infrastructure of the LCD wall itself kind of comes up in that sense, in the experience of the work as a video installation. And that I think that also for me relates to this, because a big part of this narrative, there's this kind of technological element or this question of technology that haunts this entire period. And I mean, back to your earlier point about how this kind of present and the past speak to each other, I think this question of technology is also a very, very contemporary issue, especially if you think about the issue of Chinese technology. And if you were to go back to, if you think about the 70s as this historical period when the Communist Party was trying to, sever the link between technology and political ideology, to think of technology as somewhat a technical question rather than a political question. It seems as if this there is a kind of repoliticization that is happening right now, but not along the lines of, let's say, capitalism versus socialism, but in a more kind of say nationalist lines or even more kind of a outdated binary, so to speak. So I think for me, like the Canton Fair is a very kind of productive space to think about when we think about these kind of contemporary geopolitical tensions.
Yeah, and what I love is that also that, you were actually here in Hong Kong not that long ago. One of the few people from outside Hong Kong that I've been able to see in the past a year and a half, let's say. And so it's great to see, and you were in the middle of filming this. So, and so this part that you sort of excerpt from is kind of grounded here in Hong Kong, kind of, based in the history here. But you mentioned that you're thinking, this is kind of ultimately extending into China. So can you say a little about, how you think of developing this?
Yeah, because I think that history of the textile industry is, I mean, in the narrative that you see here, it begins after the industry has already moved to Hong Kong. So there's actually an earlier history in the 1920s of the start of the textile industry in China, in the Shanghai and Yangtze Delta region. And actually, I mean, earlier in the talk, I mentioned that I'm interested in, these flows of labor, technology, and capital. And I mentioned them in this sequence partly because the entire work looks at these three terms in a kind of dialectical relationship to each other. But I think in different historical periods, you also see that one term become extremely dominant over the others. So in the earlier historical period, let's say in the 20s, just prior to the communist takeover, you see that labor is actually that dominant term that comes to structure all other social relations. I think when you come to the 40s, and especially this moment in the 70s that we are talking about, technology becomes that dominant term against which all other terms kind of revolve around. And the last chapter, when we talk about finance, when we talk about real estate, I think that's when we really look at money capital as taking on a kind of autonomy in itself. And I think it speaks to the state of the world that we are in today.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that's, kind of really thinking about technology and capital and finance and kind of the way that they all fuse together and come together is a really kind of really tantalizing glimpse into the project. And I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that I'm looking forward to really seeing the whole cycle. But at this point, I'm going to hand things over. Speaking of real estate and development, I'm going to hand things over to Annie, who I think will be talking about related topics with our next guest.
Firstly, thank you so much, Lawrence and Rui An, for your brilliant presentations that critique different systems and the development and transformation of resources while thinking about futures, past, and the contemporary. And we continue this journey of tracking ideas of imaginary and material capital with Indonesian artists Irwan, Ahmett, and Tita Salina. They are known for their performative and provocative works that address planetary anxieties in relation to environmental and ecological injustice, especially their long-term project related to the Ring of Fire, the region most prone to natural disasters, as well as traumatic histories caused by persistent ideological violence. Today, very excitingly, they will share reflections from their 5,600 kilometer journey that they undertook for the making of Decapitated Capitals, a work in progress that took them from Jakarta to East Kalimantan. So this is a journey through space and time from the current capital to another future and past of Indonesia or ancient Nusantara under the Majapahit Empire in the 14th century. So the current, past, and future capital cities are sedimented with narratives of contestation, cultural and historical plunder, and are also global participants and witnesses to the unbearable ecological problems due to exploitation of natural resources in the developing country such as Indonesia, which is also currently in an era of massive industrialization, boosted by its own demographic bonus of an abundant, productive population. So without further ado, I hand over to Tita and Irwan, who will take us on this journey.
And thank you, Ani, for the introduction.
Okay, we're going to start the
Right now, we are in Bandung, West Java, a place that was once very important on the peak of tension between West and East Bloc in the Cold War period. The Bandung Conference of 1955, or people call it the Asia-Africa Conference, was attended by 29 countries, bringing up a typical utopian agenda of newly independent countries from the cycles of colonialism. The euphoria and solidarity from that event had created stories which effectively to eternalize nationalism residue that was very problematic today.
A few hours ago, there were a series of world leaders meeting at the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland. From the documentations of those leaders is hardly or even not seen the presence of Asia-Africa spirit. The ego or idealistic ideology in 1955 has shifted to be the economic reconciliation strategy, which is proven as the vehicles of countries that were poor to become economic giants.
What were they talking about? Were they discussing orangutan? Or were discussing a Posut Mahakam or Irrawaddy dolphin that are only 88 left? Were they discussing the indigenous amid the threat of the majority's superior identity?
Of course not. Usually, it is typically masculine conversations, whether it's about power or territory. For example, it is about the border issue in South China Sea or the tensions in Myanmar. Topics related to the power of the military are more masculine to discuss.
Following the news about this summit, I am more and more convinced that the human population on this planet is under the control of the elites, where actually in the colony of proboscis monkeys that is constantly pushed away from human activity, the alpha male could have 5 to 7 wives. And in most of their colonies, there is one central figure that keeps its colony equilibrium. Not the alpha male, but a most respectful female. It's able to reduce conflict. So when this equilibrium keeper got killed, division follow with violence would soon arrive.
Hey, Irwan, we are not talking about the conference of monkeys, are we? Do you have a speculative assumptions about what those important people are talking about?
Yeah, it's the monkey, but Biden said in a speech of Director's Office US National Intelligence last July 27, President of the superpower said that Jakarta is sinking due to the climate change that's been haunting all over the world. That statement about the moving capital from Jakarta to East Kalimantan has prompted us to do a road trip for 5,600 kilometers back and forth. From the decapitated capital, Jakarta, we traced along Java, including the north coast, then crossed to East Kalimantan, where the new capital will be constructed.
Please let us share a small part from a big narrations about ambitions, industrial characteristics, and the desire to colonize. The threat of sea level rise is not only happening in Jakarta, but the threat is widespread to the north coast of Java area in unimaginable scale. A striking area of coastal erosions also occurred in Pekalongan. In 17 years, approximately 300 hectares of land was inundated by seawater. And one of the fastest growing cities in Indonesia, Semarang, didn't miss to develop its coastal area by reclamations. The aggressions area of 288 hectares is mostly contributed by urban development of the coastal city. In spite of that, it also experienced a wide erosions of 248 hectares.
Well, to find out how a civilization was destroyed, we made a visit to the ancient capital of Nusantara, which is now already 2 meters below the surface.
The Majapahit Empire is believed to rule the territory where modern Indonesia is located today. Even its narration is claimed to be one-sided by our founding fathers when freed from Japan in order to strengthen a national story that's capable of binding the diversity. Although our knowledge about this lost civilization is very little.
A civilization that has existed for 3 centuries, from 13 to 16, attained its peak of glory with distinctive characteristic as an agricultural society that had succeeded in optimizing the potential of their territory. Fertile soil due to volcanic eruption, abundant water from rivers, and notable ability to irrigate farms had made these people in Majapahit era become the first crazy rich Asian in Nusantara. Hey, there is also gold. We can find it there.
These animal bones are proof that people at that time could control large animals such as buffalo, horses, and even elephants to help farming through collaborations among them. In order to optimize it, stories and myths were created. Hinduism and Buddhism are the main basis to unify the similar stories. It is very hard and even impossible to find human bones because most of them were cremated. These old ceramics revealed a theory that in Majapahit era, it built most cosmopolitans and relationships with other parties, such Ming and Yuan dynasty, or Muslim traders, whom also brought Islam from Central Asia. These civilizations during the Majapahit kingdom was very close to terracotta. This object that records permanently the gentle pressure of fingers was used to keep a placenta. This tradition is still carried out by modern Javanese today, where in Javanese belief, the placenta is a sibling that must be treated as important as the baby. This basic concept is suspected of being the initial bond of land and water relations, the forerunner of the emergence of identity.
while we observing the remains of civilizations 2 meters below, our fate met with a new friend that we call the left eye. This could be a strange phenomenon. People didn't bury their bodies, they cremated them. How could this head be separated from the body in such a pathetic state? Was left eye preyed by the now extinct Japanese tiger? Was left eye a victim of natural disaster like a landslide, flood, tsunamis, or volcanic eruption? Was left eye a murder victim?
Pembunuhan ini. Ini mas, ini bolong nih mas tuh.
Our initial interventions was to ask a person who claimed himself an intermediary between the two worlds through ritual dance. According to him, left eye was killed by the sibling due to the conflicts related to unrealized lust and greed. Was left eye a king or queen? Was left eye a rebel? Was left eye an ordinary farmer?
Of course, this is something couldn't be equally compared. But if we look how the genocide carried out by the ant colonies against another, it can be an illustration of how the ancient desire human animality could be more structured and massive. So the losers had to evacuate massively to move the capital city. Not only were their treasures looted, but the civilization was destroyed by breaking down the dams. So the advanced and established civilization were swallowed up by the earth.
To see a sample of the process of one lost civilizations, we don't need to be a time traveler. Not so far from the Majapahit site, about 50 kilometers to the east side of Java, there is a man-made disaster site. The mud that comes out of the bowels of the earth due to the failure of gas drilling has caused an uncontrolled mud flow for more than 15 years. 10,000 houses, 16 villages, and countless livestock were buried in a gray liquid smells of toxic methane gas.
When I dived into the mud, the light disappears, just a faint darkness. I feel like being in a womb. It was warm, soft, and fluid, but could kill me at any moment. Could it be left eye suffer the same strategy, the same tragedy as me a few centuries ago?
From the ancient capital in the 16th century, we continue the journey to the new capital in the 21st century. Moving the capital is actually not a new idea. It has been discussed since the first presidents of Indonesia, and this plan was suddenly announced just a couple months ago. With some luck, we entered the site of the new capital, which felt strange. This place that would be sacred to ultranationalists and capitalists is filled with polluted air due to overloaded timber carrier trucks. The residents are industrial plant workers with unhappy expressions, while on the other side, it's filled with indigenous Dayak people whose culture, forests, and lands are amputated.
The development of a new capital city with 260,000 hectares, almost twice the size of London, is involving a big player steering committee. Among them are
Tony Blair, a former UK Prime Minister,
Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, known by his initial MBZ, a crown prince of Emirates of Abu Dhabi.
Masayoshi Son from Japan, the current owner of two well-known unicorns in Southeast Asia.
Last week, the ambassador of AU for Southeast Asia come to East Kalimantan and explore potential investment there.
Artists, TikTokers, architects, urban planners, academics, world-class consulting companies arrive like a tsunami accompanied by land speculators who are busily looting profits from this prospective capital city. No orangutans, no proboscis monkey, no hornbill birds. There is only a great ape with an industrialist characteristic called Homo sapiens.
Finally, our mission was achieved: to plant a time capsule in the area that will become the most important architectures for the future of Nusantara. It contains a prophecy, utopia dreams, or a symbol of a very expensive effort that is unfortunately in vain.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irwan and Tita. What a journey. I feel like when we met in 2019, I think that was the last time we met in real life in Jakarta, was when you actually were telling me about thinking of Jakarta and you wanted to build this boat. And I was so like excited. I wanted to come with you. And of course, like all the pandemic hit. And so after today's presentation, I feel like we managed to take our journey after all. So thank you so much. And this is really quite an incredible journey you've shared with us, as it takes us from, I guess, both across geographical space, but also traces these older movements of trade and flow and uncovers archaeologically like these traces, older histories, which speak of ancient settlements and kingdoms in this region of Southeast Asia. And often this region of Southeast Asia is framed perhaps as with reference to the ASEAN bloc, or in terms of developing nations that are industrializing. It sort of negates narratives of these kind of older sedimentations of historical narratives. So, your presentation through this journey that you've tracked opens up a much longer view in terms of our relation to land, our relationship to labor in its involvement with the land. And it's really also evocative that the placenta jar, is it, that you share with us with the imprints of, the fingerprints, also makes me think back to the image of hands at the blackjack table in Lawrence's work, the invisible hand that Rui An spoke about. And this question, I guess, of human labor, artistic labor, and its involvement, and the acts of violence, I think that you also allude to, which is a concern of yours, how these have had a very fraught relationship, I guess, with the environment and the natural ecologies around us. And I think this has been really important to your practice, and I wonder if you could share a little bit more about that with us.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. I mean, this is it's like still overwhelming. So this journey, we collect so many things. Of course, after 2 years stay at home, it's like really I become kids again to play with the coals and pee on a massive vehicle on the big river. So this is kind of exploring the possibility our body to re-celebrate what is the catastrophe and what is the imagination. Yeah, and even it's a very strange journey because it's always come out in our head. This is gonna be the last journey. Can still we make it in the future? So this is kind of very unstable, constant feelings all the time. Yeah, but the thing is, what we didn't see from the big city, that now we realize it keep happening. Doesn't matter the pandemic or not. So that present the body as a witness and also absorbing all information like the smells, temperatures, the tensions, and that kind of sensory. It's like makes me think, am I romanticism artist? Need this kind of stimulation all the time? Mm-hmm. So yeah, but also like to open up the possibility of what is the real happening there. It's important for us, but maybe take a little bit risk to going deep about this research.
I mean, I think that's really interesting. You're speaking about, I guess, the human body itself being an archive of these responses to this different, I suppose, stimuli in ecology around us, or the effects perhaps of heavy industrialization, as we know, like pollutants that are in the air or in the water do impact us in the long run, and certainly impact our food supplies and water supplies. But it's really interesting also that you showed us the skull that you found, which also goes to show like we are so imbricated into these narratives as the, in terms of the human race, in terms of how that is impacting the way land is being shaped and used, especially shown very evocatively through your images. Can you tell us a bit more about what has happened to the skull or the person that you found, and what are your thoughts about who that is and what does that mean?
Yeah, Tita?
Yeah, well, of course, there's a lot of theories and assumptions, but of course, we don't know where or who to ask for. That's why we come up with this person who claimed himself as a medium to use his body to have a conversations with another world, and but also interesting that this person is also how do you say, he's kind of like a local archaeological, so he's really fond to the Majapahit kingdom's history, and yeah, for now he is the only person that we can ask for, but of course we really are curious about what is exactly and how old is the skeleton age, but I think it should take like series of laboratory involvement, or ask for archaeologists, or ask for forensic, for example. I think that's the next step. But yeah, for according to his assumption, so this person could be he or she, and this person was killed because of domestic how do you say, problems, domestic arguments with the siblings.
Yeah, but I mean the strange feeling when we encounter the human remains, right? It's very strange. Things feel connected with this object even already 2 meters below surface or a centuries ago. But this is like from real humans, and how we have to pay a respect to this poor person. Yeah, we're thinking maybe, is it like we need to bury it again in the proper way? As, but what is religion? I mean, 200 years ago, maybe Java is still Hindu or Buddhas. When we make this ritual into the Muslim, it's going to be problematic. You know?
I mean, that of course speaks to a complex religious history as well of Indonesia. But it's also such an interesting comment. You say that to find the remains of the human person within the grounds, which should be quite a natural place to find, it feels very strange. And yet, of course, we have these different problematic encounters with human remains within institutions that seem very normalized as well. So there's so much here that we could really unpack, I think, in relation to how we frame our encounters with land and history. But in being mindful of time, I'm going to hand over to Ming Tiampo, and then we'll all get a chance to further this conversation together. Thank you so much for your presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annie.
Welcome.
Thank you, Tita, Irwan, and Annie. That was absolutely fantastic, and such a privilege to see your new project as it develops. It's such a beautiful and chilling investigation into the past, and thinking about how this is going to impact our futures. And, you know, this is something that I really see as being very, as a thread that has woven through all three artist presentations, this question of how the past and the present are entangled, and how each of these artists are individually invested in critically reimagining what those pasts are. As Hammad was saying, you know, whose pasts, what pasts are we investigating? And in surfacing these critical pasts, we're talking very much about the possibility of building new liberatory futures. And this is something that just keeps on coming up over and over again in this session. For me, what I'd really like to find out about, and I'm going to just keep my comments very short, and I will take the sort of privilege of being the moderator here in order to ask a first question. But I would ask you all to put your questions in the chat box. I am aware of time. I am aware of the fact that we should be ending in about 2 minutes. But given the richness of these presentations, I think it's really important for us to take maybe 15 minutes more to do a little bit of discussion and to sort of dig deeply and understand what the entanglements are between our three artist presentations. If you do have to leave, please feel free to do so, and you'll be able to catch up with the recordings online, and also through that you'll be able to, the moderators will put the links in the chat so that you can find where the recordings will be. And please also do catch up with us in Venice in the spring. So the question that I wanted to ask our artists, and maybe is everyone here at this point? Okay, perfect. is really a question about capitalism, because I think that fundamentally that's what links all three of your investigations, and are your investigations of liquidity, of capitals, of capital, and really trying to understand what the relationships are between our recent pasts and our presents, and seeing how they are entangled. So for Lawrence and Rui An, I'm interested in hearing you both comment on what the socialist legacies are of capitalism in China and how that impacts the ways in which we understand how capitalism shapes our senses of self and how we organize society, how we create value. And I think that these are questions that address both of your presentations. And for Tita and Irwan, I'm really interested in this comment that you made about the relationships between ultranationalism and capitalism. You know, we're talking about flow, we're talking about the movement of capital across the entire world. And very rightly, you point to the ways in which ultranationalism and capitalism can and are linked. And I'd like to hear you comment on those relationships, please. So whoever would like to start first can do so. Otherwise, I might choose
I'll just
Lawrence,
say,
perfect. I was going to choose.
I'm far from an expert on China, basically, but I would refer everyone who's interested to the Marxist journal Chuang, who are a group of kind of scholars, not entirely, pretty anonymous, who write about the histories and present, I don't know if it's predicament is the right word, of of these systems. I think as a amateur sociologist, all I can say as well is that I feel these larger terms, capitalism, socialism, actually, in what I've observed, is just, it doesn't exist as a thing. There's only specific instances and histories of people trying to think about what they are. So for example, socialism exists as it's kind of like as a goal to aim for some people, just like communism or capitalism are in some certain instances, but it's just a collection of really disparate and different attempts at making it happen, I guess. Like for me, Sino-futurism, it's a conspiracy theory, not a manifesto, because it's possible to reconstruct any narrative of the future or of the past. So that ability to construct a myth is what I think this discourse shares, and it's kind of dangerous in a sense. So that's why I always say it's only a specific instance or a really limited viewpoint.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. Rui An?
Quite a big question to answer, but I guess I'll try. I mean, I was interested, in the Canton Trade Fair, exactly because of this question that you posed, and I think the 70s were a very interesting historical period to look at some of these shifts between ideas of socialism and capitalism. And I'll just bring up one instance actually, because even prior to the Canton Trade Fair, many of these socialist bloc countries, they also have their own version of the trade fair. And in the film, actually, it's not in the excerpt that I showed, but in the film, I actually talked about how the technology it's called open-end spinning, which became the dominant, like a key technological innovation that's used by the textile industry around the world. It was first invented in Czechoslovakia in 1963. So you had this technology that came out of a socialist command system, and then it was being marketed at the trade fair in Czechoslovakia in 1965. Capitalist countries, England, saw this amazing technology and brought the technology back. And then that technology then becomes used to produce denim. So it creates this massive denim boom in the 1970s, of which Hong Kong was a key part of. Which also brings up another question, because denim used to be a working class fabric, and then in the 70s it became this signifier of almost middle class consumerism. But that whole technology, in a way, if you trace it back, came out of the socialist command system. So that was in the 60s. So I think the Canton Fair becomes an even richer space to look at these intersections, because these were exactly spaces where you see two different systems, countries coming from capitalism, countries coming from socialism, and having all kinds of encounters that sometimes are not very, it's kind of irreducible to either one of these systems. But I think the 70s were interesting also because at least there was the possibility of a multiplicity of systems, or that there at least these signifiers, there was some kind of meaning behind, what a socialist mode of production is. And I think increasingly we feel like this idea of an alternative to a global capitalist system is increasingly foreclosed. And which is why for me, like the 70s are a very rich historical period to really look at, what exactly were the tensions that these different people were negotiating with, and how they were trying to, shift ideologically and respond to, some of these broader geopolitical shifts that they seem to feel as if they have no agency to contain.
Thank you so much. These are really exciting and interesting conversations. And I think just in the interest of time, I'll hand it over to Tita and Irwan to think about what the relationships are between ultranationalism and capitalism that you brought up.
Well, it's a broad question, but I would like to answer from architecture's mindset. So for the example, one of the standing point of the architecture plans for the new capitals, it's the shape of the myth bird who adapted from India, actually, the Garuda, right? That's Vishnu bird, it's a giant bird, vehicles. But there is no eagle, there is no Garuda in Kalimantan. Even in Java, they're almost extinct due to the human activities. So by bring this myth or eagle shape of the architectures to the Kalimantan, it is like represent how nationalism works. As a diversity of nation in Indonesia, we need always an enemy to keep unite, or maybe to refresh the myth constantly to keep this more effective collaboration in a large scale. And when it's come, of course, who is the idea? I mean, in the 0 kilometers of the area, every person we ask, they don't have no idea, even they don't agree to have this capital in their own territory. They really worry about the impact for the long term. But in the sake of capitalism, the money comes to them easily, and they just sell the land and the memories to the capitalist mindset who come to the capital in the dramatic way. And because this like a easy and cash and carry era, right? I mean, today people are very lazy to invest in a social process. So money is a very effective way to bribes, to do a corruption, or even to buy an artwork.
Thank you so much. Tita, did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think Irwan told everything quite well. Well, I think also I just want to add a little thing that Indonesia is a really huge country, that we are imagined community. That's why we need like a really big ideas, or how do you say, yeah, like big ideas like nationalisms to unify us. Although it's not always a good story, but we have more violent story than a good story, unfortunately. But that's still our leaders think this is the how to say, the perfect way to unify these diversities among us.
Yeah, I mean, if compared to termite colonies, I'm not surprised. This is a very basic animal instinct in our minds, that we keep moving and colonize the other part of the area territories. So we just like termites.
We're just like termites. Actually, that's a really interesting way to sort of bring together our reflections on liquidity in terms of capital and also in terms of environmental destruction, and to think the ways that capital feeds into the current crisis that we're in. We have some questions from the audience. In particular, let's see, we have two from Mahan Moalemi, which I can maybe paraphrase a little bit and combine. He's addressing Rui An and Lawrence, but I think this is these are questions that can also be asked to Tita and Irwan in terms of basically the relationship between aesthetics and politics. You know, where, you know, he asks Lawrence about the question of genre and what kind of genre Sinofuturism is, if it's based on other types of genres. And Rui An, he asks about the question of determinism and teleology when it comes to doing such a historical project, and asking if there are ways of leaving spaces for exit or reentry, and what are the potentialities of abstraction. You know, I think that that's something that Rui An and Tita and Irwan also are engaging with very effectively in their work, and in the ways in which they use abstraction and poetics. So I'd be curious to hear what you all have to say about that relationship between poetics and politics.
Okay, I'll just go. I think another huge question. I think Mahan's question was about how do I see Sinofuturism as a genre. I think it's really interesting, this idea of genre versus style, because to me genre like speaks more of a kind of idiom from literature, really, literature or film or kind of narrative. I feel what genre does in general is to set certain expectations in the mind of a viewer or author in terms of how the narrative will unfold, what kind of the mood of the world is. For example, science fiction as a genre, conspiracy theory as a genre, romantic comedy as a genre, to think about what the payoff is of watching a certain thing. So I think if it's manifesto as a genre, I think the payoff, like let's say Communist Manifesto, the payoff is meant to be that you buy into the worldview that the manifesto is creating. But for me personally, like I was saying, a conspiracy theory as a genre it's similar to a manifesto in that it wants you, the viewer, to believe a certain speculative theory about reality and history that might not necessarily be true. So it's kind of it's meant to be persuasive, I think. But my video essay is specifically meant to be anti-persuasive. It's meant to just be like all of these tools that are trying to persuade you of a certain point of view are actually incredibly biased. So it's a counter manifesto in that sense of genre.
Thank you. Like a sort of toolkit for criticality in this age of post-truth, perhaps. Rui An?
Maybe I'll just take it. Yeah, I guess for me, I'm interested in history in different registers. So actually, I guess in the two films that I mentioned, Student Bodies and this recent Lining Films, there is of course on the one hand, there's this chronology that you see, which goes from one year to another, which for me kind of represents the kind of abstracted form of history, which for all its abstraction, you know, it does come to determine our political and social realities. But at the same time, I think when I'm, at least in these two films, I think what's very important for me is to bring in these different voices. And the film itself, this in Lining, you also hear these different voices coming from these different perspectives. And some of the things that they, and it's also not just about the multiplicity itself, but also a different scale of experiences. So on the one hand, you have this narrative of the Canton Fair, of geopolitical encounters at the fair. But actually, you also have stories of, let's say, a machine operator. And actually, I mean, I didn't show that excerpt of where the machine operator was talking about experiences, but actually that whole process is just really talking about how she operates the machine and how her hand is almost like a supplement to the machine itself, in the sense that her manual labor is essential to the functioning, the smooth operation of the machine. So I think for me, it's very important that these different registers that come to kind of complicate each other. And so that's why the film is structured as such.
Thank you. Tita and Irwan, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Perhaps Tita will answer. Yeah.
You go ahead first.
Yeah, we would like to show this. Maybe our genre is inspired by these creatures.
I'm sorry, perhaps this looks like an abstract, but actually this is a fungi. This a species of fungi that attacks a moth. So we found this fungus in one of the original forests in Balikpapan city, in Kalimantan, in East Kalimantan. So this fungus is called zombie ant fungus. So it attacks the brain, not the brain, the nerve of insects like moths, ants, butterflies, small animals. And then when it attacks the nerve, then it controls this animal, like this moth, for example. So this moth cannot fly to the place where it wants to go. All their nerve was controlled by this fungus.
Automatically they try to find the light, and then after that the fungus grow into the body and spread to other insect. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is very inspiring. I think maybe this is our genre. This really want to do like this fungus.
That's beautiful. I love this idea of, you know, the fungus as a sort of liberatory aesthetics, you know, that infiltrates other creatures. So we have one last question, I think, before we have to go. There is a question here from Bidisha. A question for Lawrence Lek, inspired by a comment that Irwan made about creating art under lockdown and regression to a kid-like state, opening up new paths to creativity. How have the pandemic and lockdown affected your practice? Is your work from 2020 now different in means or ends from what you created before? I am particularly interested in your composition, music, and soundtracking. Thank you, Bidisha.
Thanks for the question. I mean, I think the kind of perverse, paradoxical thing is I was, you know, making work about, you know, people being isolated by technology in 2019. So since then, I've been actually kind of happier, basically, not in the sense that it's like being realized, but talking about music and composition specifically, I feel that as you know, a screenwriter, as a writer, researcher, filmmaker, or like 3D world designer, you're always composing. What do I mean by that? You're always planning, making things for the future work that will be enjoyed in real time, in the present. So actually, it's such a future-oriented practice that you rarely get the chance to actually enjoy the process. The difference with music, of course, is that you can be a musician as a composer and a musician as a performer. As a performer, you're enjoying things in real time, in the now, in the present. You don't have a kind of self-consciousness that you would get if you're in a composition mode. So just generally, I've just tried to be more in that free mode of engaging in the present through whether it's music or filmmaking sometimes. One of the problems actually in being primarily an animator is that there's so much labor involved in creating the world, and actually the part where you're actually filming, it's really small and towards the end. So I've tried to have as much of that live cinematography within the process as well, so I can keep the process as live as possible. Yeah, and I feel that's always a challenge. When the more complex a work gets, the harder it is to actually focus on the most enjoyable part, which is improvisation, things that are live, things that are more performative, even if it's a very technology heavy practice.
Thank you, Lawrence. I wonder if Rui An, Tita, and Irwan, if you have any comments about how your practice changed under lockdown.
Who's first?
How did your artistic practice change under lockdown?
Yeah, so we are like I thought before, it's like a kid. So we become like enthusiasts with like the biology, nature, or evolution process, because we stuck our body digitally all the time. So when we go outside, the sound of nature, it's like stimulating the very archaic feelings. That's touch the sensibility our artistic practices, and we just like a very understand how the European, they looted so many artifacts from Indonesia, because we did the same things. When we come to Kalimantan, we collect many things. We collect quartz, collect leaves, insects, ceramics, everything. So maybe this is the feeling of rebels when looted all artifacts from Sultanate Palace to British maybe. So, but of course, this is like the feeling that maybe this is our last journey. This like really makes us a little bit greedy to become a collectors.
Yeah, maybe that's also comes because of in 2020, for example, we really almost stuck in our home for 20 hours for the whole year. That's also of course influence about our practice, because before through traveling or journey, it's really our vehicles to do observations, to do a research, but because we couldn't do that, so somehow the attention to the journey shifted to the more domestic research. Like for example, last year, the first project we produced, it was mostly about ants. And how the ants colonies
in our backyard.
Yeah, in our backyard, and how the ant species could invade our homes and eat our leftovers. And but of course, it's really interesting also about what Irwan said, like a study about the non-human species and how it's really somehow we really have a similar behavior or characteristic, even with the ants, not only with other apes, other monkeys. Yeah.
Does this make sense? I would think to learn orangutan language, so perhaps in the future we could speak with them.
Yeah, I think like for like actually just like Tita and Irwan mentioned, because a lot of my practice depends on traveling and being on site at these different locations. So of course there's been a real challenge trying to navigate that. But I was, in a way, I was quite lucky in the sense that I managed to still do like the residency at Chet. So I had some institutions who are willing to support the work, even though it means that in the past year I've done a number of hotel quarantines. So that has been a key change in the practice, spending time in quarantine, and yeah, just to go to a new location. But I do also feel like that also makes you kind of treasure that experience much more. and to really, you know, the sense of being in a different location after so long, it's really precious. And I mean, I say this especially coming from Singapore, which is just like it's a city state. So there isn't really much of a hinterland to even go to. So I did appreciate the fact that I did manage to still produce some work even within the last 2 years.
Thank you for those illuminating answers. I think that this relationship between the embodied and the digital is such an interesting one that has emerged over the last 2 years in such new and embodied ways. We should really wrap up now. However, there is one extremely meaty question that I'd like to pose to all of you. So please, if you could just give it a very quick answer, if possible. If not, then, you know, obviously, please reflect on it. It's quite an interesting one and really fundamental to this particular conversation, which is a question from Mai Ardia, who asks, how would you define the notion of liquidity within your work presented here? What is liquidity in relation to your work? And she says, I would be interested in hearing a short answer from each artist if possible. And I would add here that maybe Hammad, John, Annie, please jump in if you want to say a few words on this question of liquidity, which after all is the thread that is bringing us all together today.
I'll just jump in quickly again. I guess short answers for me, liquidity, it's what I'm trying to arrive at is like this kind of state of flow between, you know, navigating different economic and social conditions of like producing my work. And because, you know, water is such a, I feel water is such an overused metaphor. So I try not to overthink the whole water thing, basically. And especially in Chinese culture, it can be like a massive cliche. So I think it's just a state of going with the flow sometimes.
For me, I think of this quote by Akbar Abbas when he was writing about Hong Kong. He talks about how in Hong Kong, just as an example, the seemingly permanent can become temporary, or the temporary can become permanent. And I think liquidity is pretty much about that condition.
Well, this answer better to us, to the creatures who live on the water. So for this, our answer is the same answer like what the dolphin said. This is the answer.
Oh, wait. Oh.
Yeah, that's the answer.
Thank you so much. So now that we've heard from the dolphin, perhaps we could hear from all of you in the chat as well as we wrap up here. If you have any thoughts on liquidity from your perspectives, that would be most welcome. I hand the mic over to Annie.
I think it's very fitting that we end with, a non-human species also intervening into this conversation. Thank you so much, Lawrence, Rui An, Tita, and Irwan, for taking us through such different journeys where the intersections have really enlightened and provoked us with an understanding of longer historical legacies and entanglements of exchange, appropriation, and restitution of value. I think for me, liquidity also, I think, refers to that agility to move between conditions and a dexterity that we're trying to develop as we see, fast developments in technology these days that are changing the way currencies flow. So with our experiences of isolation in various configurations over this last year, Asia Forum has been extremely privileged to host 2 digital events, bringing together the best minds in research, curatorial, and artistic practice for collective reflections and generative discussions. The refocusing of attention through the lens of Asia has revealed layers of entangled histories that continue to embed and permeate new global developments, while keying in onto critical urgencies in art, society, and ecology. The video of this event will be made available for rewatching, so please do look out for our posts in the coming months. Also do look out for further announcements regarding our program on the 23rd of April in 2022 at the Fondazione Querini Stampaglia in Venice, alongside the opening of the 59th Venice Biennale. I also say a big thank you to Hammad Nasar, Tain, and Ming Tiampo of Asia Forum's 2021-2022 Working Council for your incredible hard work and inspiration this year. Thank you to Alka Bagri and the Bagri Foundation, without whom this would not have been possible. Thank you to Art Review, our media partner, and Something Human for the additional support. And thank you everyone for joining us. See you next spring. Keep safe.